have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Claudia Black. And I think it's been a long time since you came to London. So welcome back. It's a true pleasure, a true honor for me to welcome you, Claudia, tonight. I was thinking how to best present you, but I think it's important we go back to a very strict basic here. Dr. Black is a renowned author and trainer. She's internationally recognized for pioneering and contemporary work with family systems and addictive disorders. Claudia is the clinical architect at the Claudia Black Young Adult Center at the Meadows. Furthermore, she serves as a senior fellow and has been a clinical consultant at the Meadows Treatment Center in Arizona since 1998. And I thank Sean Walsh, who is somewhere in the back here, the CEO of the Meadows, for having made that possible. Thank you, Sean. Claudia's seminal work with children impacted by substance abuse in the late 70s created the foundation for the adult child movement. Her pioneering contributions are many. She was the first to name and coin the dysfunctional family rules. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Oh yes. She described the phenomena of delayed stress, emotional trauma, the child's denial process, and looking good kids as they relate to growing up with addiction, hence the meaning and phraseology of adult children of alcoholics. She broke the barrier and openly discussed physical and sexual abuse in the context of addicted families. Her work and passion offers a foundation for those impacted by addiction and trauma to recover, and gives our professional field a library of both depth and breadth. She's one of the original founders and serves on the advisory board of the National Association of Children of Addiction and serves on the advisory committee for Camp Mariposa, the Moyer Foundation's National Addiction Prevention and Mentoring Program. Claudia is the recipient of numerous national awards, including the 2004 Distinguished Alumni Award from the University of Washington School of Social Work, the 2010 Conway Hunter Award for Excellence in the Field of Addiction, the 2012 Robert Remer Addiction Professional Award, the 2014 Father Joseph Martin Professional Excellence Award, and the NADAC 2014 Lifetime Achievement Award. Claudia is the author of over 16 books, the latest title being Unspoken Legacy, addressing the impact of trauma and addiction within the family. She has also produced CDs and DVDs, mostly available through Central Recovery Press. And speaking about that, tomorrow, 1 p.m., tomorrow Wednesday, there's a book signing on the Central Recovery Press stand, that is stand number 31, I think, downstairs. So, tonight, Unspoken Legacy, Reverberations of Trauma in the Addicted Family. I'm not going to unveil anything, Claudia, here, but we had a lovely conversation of ours in Scottsdale the other day, and I've just shared with you one thing I want to share with you guys. I'm French, as you may have heard, and the word reverberation is French, réverbération. Now, it means two things. It describes the mirroring, and it describes the wave. So it's a combination of a concept of a wavelength and the mirroring. And when I saw that title in one of the chapters of your book, I went, wow, this really resonates with me. That's the only thing I can say here, Claudia. A very warm welcome, Dr. Claudia Black.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
My pleasure to be here. Justin's in the back, and he's handling the microphone, so I think we're doing just fine. We will be in just a second. I want to thank ICAD for the opportunity in which to be here, the invitation. They have asked me at other times, and I've not been able to come, but I'm here today. And I want to thank the Meadows for facilitating and making that possible for me to be here as well. It's always a wonderful opportunity for me to talk about that which I have great passion about, what I really devoted, and I was realizing that I often say what I've devoted my adult career to as if I had a career previously. But I did, as many of us did, growing up in alcoholic homes. It would set the stage for how it is I would, one, live out certain parts of my life, but even more so how it is I would come to shape what it was that I would do professionally. I don't have a lot of time in which to be with you. I do want to say that it was in 1982 that I was last in England. And I presented at Oxford University. There was an international conference there. So that dates me a little bit, but it also says in 1982 there were people here in the United Kingdom that certainly had an interest in addiction and had an interest enough to invite me to talk about very young children in terms of how it is they're impacted by substance use disorder within that family system. And so it's taken this amount of time. So again, just truly a pleasure for me to come back and be with you. Unfortunately, what we've learned over the years is that addiction doesn't just belong to the addict. It very much, unfortunately, also belongs to that family system. And I think that's said very eloquently by a picture that was drawn in my early work with very young children as I was talking with kids between ages of 5 and 12, and we would often try and give them an understanding of what it was they were living with. A little boy, we did a lot of artwork, and he said, alcohol and drugs are like dominoes. They knock down the person who knocks down everybody else, including themselves. And then what you see at the bottom, some of you are going to have a hard time seeing this, you do have handouts and they can be downloaded, and this is actually in the handouts. Again, you have little individual dominoes all impacting each other, and ultimately everybody's going to be impacted. Over the years, I've worked with great numbers of people. I don't know if we want to say hundreds and hundreds, or if it's just even thousands of people who've been impacted by the legacy of addiction. And I want to begin by sharing with you a couple of those stories. One is a young woman who comes in to see me, and none of the names that I use tonight will be anybody's accurate real name. Her name is Jan, though, and Jan's 34 years of age. And it's very typical that unless they're in an immediate crisis or in a detox, it's very typical that I would ask them in that first session to tell me a little bit about their growing up years. When I asked Jan if she could share with me about what it was like for her growing up, she said to me, well, Claudia, if anything, I would say we were the late night regulars. Now, I happened to grow up in a family where my parents owned a bar. And so late night regulars really meant the people that frequently, were patrons of the bar, probably on a nightly basis. But I knew enough to keep my mouth shut. That's not what she was talking about. She said we were the late night regulars at the local hospital emergency room. Mm-hmm. We were always going to the emergency room. And there was the night that my mom, she dropped a bottle of gin and hit her leg and sliced her leg wide open, and so we had to go to the ER. And then there was the night she was doing dishes. And she was loaded, and the dish broke, and she sliced her arm wide open, and off we went to the emergency room. And then, then there was the night that my parents would have these really bad fights, and she threw a salt or pepper shaker at my dad, hit him in the forehead, split his head wide open, and off we ran to the emergency room. And then she paused, and she said, and then sometimes you look back about your growing up years, and you wonder why you didn't go to the emergency room. Because there was the night I was home alone with my mom. She was an only child. I'm home alone with my mom, and I'm in a back room, and suddenly the house begins to shudder like there's a low-flying airplane. The house begins to shudder, and there's this horrible crashing noise, and then this sound, and it doesn't sound human. She said, I made my way from the back of the house into the living room, and there my mother is, pitched over this broken glass. Somehow she has fallen through the glass window out onto the porch, hanging on these big shards of glass, bleeding. And that noise that I thought was an animal is coming from my mom. She said, I thought, in the eyes of a little 9-year-old, she said, I thought my mom was just going to slice herself in half. So she said, I got out and tried to get her up off the glass, and I couldn't do it. So I ran back into the house, and I called my dad on the phone, and I got him at work. And I'm trying to scream over this horrible noise. My dad screams back that somehow I have to get her up and off that glass. I race back out there, and she said, I don't know how I found the strength, but somehow I got my mom off that glass. Well, we know how she found that strength. That was adrenaline. She said at this point she has glass in her hands, glass in her knees. She's bleeding. She's crying. Mom's making this horrible noise. Mom is still bleeding. She gets her mother back into the house. Tuesday night. I suppose it could be Wednesday night, and it could be Thursday night. People who do not live those kinds of lives, and they hear that kind of story, they say, well, then what happened? What do you mean, then what happened? Just got her mother back into the house. Nothing in particular happens. As I said, it could be any given night of the week. Well, what does happen for this young girl is within the next 3 years, her mother will die of esophageal varices as a direct result of her alcoholism. Now she will live for the next 6 years of her life with her single-parent alcoholic father. She represents 20% of children in substance-abusing homes that will have 2 addicted parents and not necessarily 1. What is true is that women tend to die from the disease of addiction earlier, at an earlier age than men do. They become more sick earlier, and they are less apt to get help, they are less apt to ask for help, and they are less apt to receive help. In reality, Jan's life is more stable with her single-parent addicted dad than it was with 2 parents, because Mom was further along in the progression, which caused more disruption in Jan's life. But when Jan leaves home at 18 years of age and enters a college setting, she does so as a cocaine-abusing alcoholic, somebody who's actively bulimic, and also somebody who's very promiscuous. And all of those issues she takes with her, as I say, into a university setting. She manages to get through 2.5 years of that university setting, but at this point she's going in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and over the next several years she will continue to go in and out of psychiatric hospitals with a lot of different diagnoses. And when she's in her very early 30s, she ends up, after a suicide attempt, she's had multiple, she ends up in a psychiatric hospital where there's a very wise physician that says to her, "You have a lot of problems." Said, but your primary problem is you have a variety of different addictions. And you have a lot of trauma. You have a lot of trauma in the context of your addictions, and you've had a lot of trauma that preceded those addictions. And we're going to see that you're treated for your many addictions, and ultimately we're going to see that you're also treated for the trauma in your life. And that's at the point that I had the opportunity in which to work with her. Now that story repeats itself in a variety of different scenarios. It could repeat itself with a young man whose name is Jake, who's 18 years of age. Jake comes into treatment as an alternative to spending time in jail. Now he begins his life with the appearance of far greater stability than Jan's life ever was experienced. But it's by the time he's in what in the U.S. we would call elementary school, upper elementary school, 5th and 6th grade, they begin to move around. They've always lived in one home, and now the family begins to move around, and Jake begins to experience a lot of tension in the home on the part of Mom and Dad. He hears arguing late at night, and all of that is because of Jake's dad's drinking. He doesn't know what's causing it at that moment, but it's all because of Dad's drinking, losing jobs. There's a very fateful night within the next 3 or 4 years. The family is going together somewhere in a car all together. There's a car accident caused because Jake's dad is impaired behind the wheel. Mom dies in the car accident. Both of the kids are seriously injured. When they come out of the hospital, the younger daughter is moved into foster care, and Jake's sent home with his dad, who had no injuries. It doesn't take long wherein the streets become Jake's place of belonging. They become his source of identity. He obviously gets into trouble with alcohol. He gets into trouble with other drugs. He gets involved in some criminal behavior. And as I say, today he's 18 years of age, but he has an opportunity because there's a judge who's saying that he has a choice. He could go to treatment in lieu of spending more time in jail. People ask, what's the prognosis for a young man such as this? And at this very moment, it's difficult to tell because what he is a young man simply trying to beat the system. We know that the impact that an addict has and or the addiction, be it a process addiction or a substance addiction, we know that the impact that it has on family members does not necessarily disappear even should the addicted person experience their own recovery process. We also know that addiction doesn't tend to spontaneously show itself within a family system. Typically what has happened is that there has been chronic stress that has become very toxic. And then there are adverse childhood responses. All of this affecting what I think of as the neurobiology, not of the individual, but the neurobiology of that family system. So let me introduce you to a woman whose name is Therese. What we know about Therese is that Therese comes into a community mental health center not because she has been the wife of 2 addicted men, not because she was raised in an addicted family system. She comes into a community mental health system on the arms of a neighbor, shuffling into that facility in a major depression. Until this last divorce, she's never ever in her life reached out and asked for help. As I say, she's struggling with a major depression. She shuffles when she walks. When she speaks, her speech is slurred. She has great difficulty making the most minor of decisions, has extremely poor self-care and very diminished expectations, and very appropriately is treated with antidepressants. But that's all that the treatment is. Well, it doesn't take too long. It's a matter of weeks, and suddenly this woman is ending up in emergency rooms as a consequence of, initially they think they're heart attacks, but as a consequence of what are anxiety panic attacks. The last one took place when she needed to make a decision when she was grocery shopping. She was in the aisle where they were selling cereal, and she was trying to decide which cereal to purchase for her 2 children. That was enough to send her into a panic attack, enough to send her into the hospital. She returns to that mental health center, and they very appropriately realize that they have a co-occurring diagnosis here, that not only does she struggle with depression, but she also struggles with anxiety. So they change her medication, and appropriately so. But one more time, that's all that they do. My point is going to be that we can treat her for depression, we can treat her for her anxiety, but unless we treat those underlying issues that fuel, unless we treat that which lies beneath that depression and that anxiety, and what's also fueling what is a pattern of very painful, hurtful, repetitive relationships, I think her prognosis ultimately is going to be very, very poor. So what I'd like to do is quickly introduce you to her husbands. This has been her last husband, who's both addicted to alcohol and a variety of other kinds of drugs. Her first husband was predominantly alcoholic. It's not a coincidence that she would marry either of these 2 people when you take a look at the kind of family that she came from. It was a very physically threatening alcoholic home. Her father was a man that was very belittling to her. He was very shaming towards her. He dismissed her presence in the favor of siblings. He was highly controlling. He controlled what it was she wore. He controlled, literally, he cut her own hair. She listened to her parents argue nightly, on a nightly basis. She experienced her mother as mostly a very frightened woman that would do anything which to appease her husband. But it's not a coincidence that she would marry these men, because they too came from homes just like her home. You put the combination of those 2 families together, and in essence what you have is Teresa's family as well. One came from a home with a very rageful father, with an emotionally needy mother. The other came from a home where there was alcoholism. It was more a father that was highly absent, who would periodically come home, so the kids were exposed to it intermittently, but a lot of poverty and a lot of illness. Research is saying to us, well, let me actually say, again, I want to introduce you to, she has a sister who dies when the sister's only 9 years of age, and Trace is slightly younger than her. She has a brother who's a compulsive overeater as a young person, and will be as an adult today. And generationally, if we go up one from the family in which she was raised, what you're going to see on the part of the paternal side of the family is chronic poverty, premature death. On the mother's side, you're going to see a process addiction with gambling, with an eating disorder. You're going to see the rage, and you're going to see the substance addiction. Now, the research tells us that protective factors for a child have to do with being able to have a special relationship with an adult who's caring and nurturing, having somewhere where you have a sense of belonging, somewhere outside of the home, being able to engage in activities outside of the home, having a sense of mastery or a feeling of success in some one area of your life, and having a sense of purpose. This did not occur for Therese. In essence, her childhood history would become her training ground long before she entered any of her 2 addictive relationships. As a child, she would come to overlook, and what I mean by that is she would learn how to deny, she would learn how to minimize, she would learn how to rationalize behavior that was highly hurtful. She She would appear cheerful when she was hurting. She would make excuses for other people's hurtful behaviors. She would learn to avoid conflict. She would learn to tolerate the inappropriate. She learned to prioritize the needs of others over her own, how to caretake others, fault herself for the family's problems, discount her own perceptions, have difficulty believing that options could be available to her, always thought that she was at fault for all the pain in the family and therefore it's her job to find the answers. She certainly learned that it wasn't okay to ask for help and in time didn't believe that help could even be available to her. And lastly, she learned to accommodate everybody else. What I'm saying here, she was raised to be the absolute perfect candidate to partner with somebody who has an addiction. And it doesn't really matter what kind of addiction it is. Raised to be the perfect partner, and with these kinds of dynamics, would enable those partners to act out their addictions with very little disruption. And by the way, it's probably a bit of interest that both of those husbands would leave her. She did not leave either of those husbands. Well, at the time, as I said, she got help. At the time that she did get help, she had those 2 children. But if we go back, what we can see is that these are children who are not only going to be exposed to so many of these dynamics as a consequence of their own parenting, but they're going to be exposed to it for generations here. You can walk into any community mental health center or in most primary health care facilities, and you're typically, at least in the States, you're going to see pamphlets that are provided through our federal government or maybe our state government. And they're often pamphlets free for the taking that they have to do about healthy parenting. Healthy parenting to prevent high-risk behavior on the part of kids. And typically, they're going to be a combination of this. For healthy parenting practices, you want to provide for the basic needs of that child and their safety. Appropriate role modeling, warm and supportive relationships. You want to be supervising your children, monitoring your children, aware of their relationships, understanding we have different temperaments and we have different needs. You want to have healthy communications and you want to have healthy rituals. Well, I'm going to go back and say, that's not going to happen. It didn't happen for Therese, and it's not going to happen for her kids. It's not going to happen for her kids because she's not capable of providing at that level. The parents, and each man was the father of one of those children, so we have 2 different fathers for the 2 children. They're not providing this kind of safety for those children. And you have such a weak and extended family system, they're not providing for those children as well. So what you're seeing is a genogram that portrays generational repetition, and the common thread throughout it's going to be toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences that are going to create trauma responses. So what I'm really going to summarize this whole point is that, in essence, left untreated, because I don't think she's been adequately treated, somebody's going to see her again. It was not all that long ago when we thought about trauma. What you thought about were situational moments of trauma, acts of terrorism. Today, the shootings that can take place, so oftentimes not just within the families, but out in public places. We think of trauma as times in which there's a natural disaster, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes. We think of something as being traumatic when one's home burns down or one is subject to a horrific car accident. But the majority of people who will experience trauma are probably going to experience something that is not near as blatant as what I just identified, something that is much more subtle, and something that is much more chronic and is more apt to exist within the confines of their own family system than outside of that family system. Now, at times of trauma, we know that the natural thing for people, the natural response, is to run. And when people first began to speak about trauma and they would present at a conference such as this, you would see pictures of an acute, blatant trauma, and you'd see people running from. But it didn't take too long when you realized they weren't just running from, they were also running towards. And typically where they were running towards was the safety of family. So the obvious question is, where do you run when that which is traumatic exists within that family system? In essence, when the hurricane is in your own family, where can you run to? When it is not physically and psychologically safe to be who you are, to speak your truth, to say what it is you see and how it is you feel, then today people move into the various trauma responses. They move into that fight, flight, or freeze. When I did my original work on adult children from alcoholic homes, we were talking about the phenomena of delayed stress, I and others in our early work. We're talking about the phenomena of delayed stress. We were talking about how people would take the vulnerability they had as children. They would take the pain that they experienced. They would take the grief that came with the chronic sense of loss, and then the inability in which to move through that pain. How it is that we would take all the defenses that we had to create for our very survivorship, and how we would take those faulty belief systems that we created about ourselves and in the world at large, how we take all of that into our adult life. We created a framework to understand what that experience was about and the impact of that experience. I think that what we also did is we created a language to give many people a voice, which was an extremely empowering experience. But what we did not clearly identify was that inability to talk, because the don't talk rule, it resonates. It resonated 40 years ago and is still resonating today for people raised in such families. What we didn't identify was that inability to articulate one's experience was also in part a trauma response. We know that the body doesn't have the ability to tell the difference between something that's an emotional emergency or physically dangerous. And when triggered, what happens? It pumps out stress chemicals that allow us to be able to fight or to be able to flee a situation. So in the case of childhood problems, when the family itself becomes the source of the stress, it isn't safe to fight, and there's no opportunity to flee. So oftentimes then we do the next natural thing, and that is we move into a freeze response. And then when our parents yell at us chronically, when our parents rage at us, when our parents pass out, we may stand there frozen in fear like a deer in headlights, ready for the fight or the flight, but literally are unable to move, and we move into that freeze. And then what happens is when we get triggered as adults, we return to those very feelings. We get flooded with stress chemicals that course throughout all of our body. And while we may be an adult, certainly look like an adult, on the inside we have all the vulnerability of who we were at 5 years of age, 10 years of age, 14 years of age. I'm aware that I speak to you as professionals. I'm also aware that as I speak today, I speak to you very personally. And so let me ask everybody to take a deep breath in and a deep breath out, okay? Everybody, no matter what the reason for being here today is, to take a deep breath in and out, because pretty soon I'll have a room of people breathing from about the nose up, okay? And then we drop. Oh, and it's also warm in here. So let's take another deep breath in and a deep breath out. And as you start to feel vulnerable, just check your breathing. Just check your breathing, and to do that for yourself as well. Being born into this world, we are only partially hardwired by nature for self-regulation. It's up to nurture to do the rest. And it's through tiny soothing interactions with caregivers, typically people in that mother and fathering role, that a child can absorb the skills of self-regulation and then ultimately internalize them for themselves. Now, children internalize a sense of safety that comes as a consequence of regular routine. Children need structure, they need routine. Children internalize a sense of safety that comes with a calm environment, a soothing touch, a calm voice. And when they experience that, they have the opportunity to develop their own skills for emotional regulation. And it's through the acquisition of those experiences, not only does a child learn to regulate themselves emotionally, but they also learn how to regulate other base functions such as mood, libido, sleep, appetite, the capacity for bonding. Now, I'm going to repeat those again because I think that's really significant. When you think about the fact that so many people raised with the kind of history that I'm talking about end up not just with substance use disorders, but they also end up with process addictions, because what I just identified was directly connected to so many of the process addictions we work with. Not only do we want our young people to learn how to develop emotional regulation, but to also to be able to regulate mood, appetite, libido, sleep, and the capacity for bonding. So, some of you I'm sure have seen this. This is a picture of what we refer to in terms of our nervous system regulation This is what we refer to as a window of tolerance or an optimal arousal zone. On a daily basis, we all have moments of increasing and decreasing arousal. And when we stay within that window of tolerance, within a certain framework, we have the ability to experience a sense of well-being. We have an ability to experience a sense of pleasure. Even in the face of stress, if we have the capacity to stay within that window of tolerance, we still have that sense that I am okay, even with all this going around me, with all this happening around me. But this next picture represents who so many of us have been in our life, and it certainly represents the clients that I work with. For so many of us, life was not safe, and we didn't have that ability in which to regulate, and we didn't have the protection that afforded us that. So most of us were highly dysregulated, moving into a hyper or hypo, and oftentimes fluctuating in between the two. Now, if we're chronically dysregulated long enough, we're going to become stuck in that dysregulated state, whether or not the original pain is present. And that's why I can be raised in a physically violent, alcoholic home, and I may gratefully leave that system at 18, 19, and 20. But I take the dysregulation with me. And I continue to defend, and I continue to operate emotionally and oftentimes mentally in the same capacity. It doesn't change. I've become stuck in this hyper or hypo system. And the more severely dysregulated and the longer that dysregulation lasts, the more likely somebody is going to find a way in which to self-medicate. We predominantly self-medicate to go in one of two directions. We self-medicate to be able to garner pleasure, and we self-medicate in order to lessen the pain in our life. And self-medicating for many people, not for everyone, but for many people will ultimately end up with addiction. And then when it ends up being an addiction, it takes on its life of its own. And now what you have is not only a severely dysregulated nervous system, you have addiction and all of its complications. When I think of trauma, Claudia, think of trauma, I think of it as when overwhelmed by a threat and you don't have the ability to successfully defend yourself, you become stuck in the survival mode. That continual state, be it a hypo or hyper state of arousal over time, begins to form those symptoms of trauma. Now, the Greek word for trauma means defeat, it means a wound, it means hurt. It clearly is not a disease, it is not a condition. It is the body and the brain's response to a severe painful experience that overwhelms somebody's ability to cope with the resulting rush of feelings and thoughts. Now, we just had some research that would come from our federal government, actually just in the last couple of months. And it would say that 75% of all of us will experience something traumatic in our lifetime. Well, I thought that was probably a bit conservative. I don't think you can have the human experience without probably experiencing something traumatic in your lifetime. So I would be more apt to say it's 99.9% of us, if not all. But it did say 75% of us. The point was that of that 75%, 1/4 of the people would show ongoing stress symptoms. The other 3/4 do not. And there are people that will demonstrate far greater resiliency in the face of traumas in their life than others. And I wanted to talk about what some of that is. The reason there is greater resiliency on the part of some versus others has to do with, one is, what was the level of support at the time of the stress that was occurring? You know, one of the things that I always have looked at when you look at families affected by addiction is some of the strengths and the vulnerabilities that differ with children within the same family. And sometimes it has to do with a grandmother moved into the home and brought stability to the home at a certain phase of that family when the acting out was going on. And some children had the benefit of that where maybe other children didn't. So where was the support at the time of the stressor? If there's fewer previous stressors, and if you're older at the time of the stressors, again, the greater the support, the more resilient. The fewer previous stressors, the more resilient. And if you tend to be older at the time, the more resilient you're going to be. Now let me give you a couple of examples of fewer previous stressors. One of the things that we take a look at a lot with our young adults in my program is the issue of bullying. Bullying is very extensive in so many parts of our country today, and I think in a lot of the world today. So I have 2 little boys, and they're in 5th grade, and they're both being bullied. It's a very painful experience. It can have lifelong consequences. But one of those boys comes from an alcoholic home, and the other boy doesn't. I can guarantee you the young boy that comes from the alcoholic home is going to be even more negatively impacted by the bullying experience. We have, in the Midwest of the United States, they're strongly subject to tornadoes, and they have shelters underground. And at a time of knowing and getting a warning that there's going to be a tornado, the people will run to their underground shelters. And so you have two women huddled together underneath in that shelter as this horrific storm is above them, and they're listening to all this. We call it the noise of a railway engine. And the storm is over, and they both come up. One of those women is in a coupleship where there's domestic violence. The woman who's in the coupleship where there's domestic violence is going to be more negatively impacted by the tear that took place in that tornado than the woman who doesn't have that experience. Again, let me say they're going to be more negatively impacted when what it is that's occurring is something that's repeated, when it is unpredictable, when it is undergone in childhood, and particularly is perpetrated by a caregiver, somebody who's supposed to be loving towards you. And that's what life is like when you're raised with addiction. It is the traumas are repeated, they typically are chronic. Now, I don't know about you, but we pretty much knew that there was going to be more trauma in my family. And so I would want to say, you could pretty much predict that the trauma would happen again. But the truth was you never knew at exactly what moment. And something that would trigger my dad one moment wouldn't trigger him the next moment. So there's a slight caveat to that here. Typically when it's undergone in childhood and perpetrated again by somebody who's supposed to be caring towards you. I think, this is just my bias, that the most identifiable source of dysfunction in families today is substance addiction. I think the most identifiable source of dysfunction in families today is substance addiction. And yet a lot of people will experience trauma in the context of their family, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Families that experience trauma certainly not just have substance use disorders, but they have other types of addictive processes going on. It could be a work addiction, it could be a gambling addiction, it could be a gaming addiction, screen addiction, it could be a sex addiction. It could be a home that doesn't have an addiction, but that there is physical abuse, that there is sexual abuse. And living in a home where there is chronic rage is living in a home where there is abuse. But I actually separated out because people normalize any type of abuse, but that I separated out because that if it's not physical, there's a tendency for people to want to minimize it, and I just want to give it its due here. At the Meadows, we talk about that which is chronically less than nurturing, and or we're talking about being raised in which families have the extreme ways of relating. They either show great disconnection or strong enmeshment. They're highly rigid to very permissive. And what I mean by rigid is they're emotionally isolated from each other. They are families where there's a lot of denial. Families where there's addiction, they're not the only families that have denial. One of the things that I often will ask family members, in this family, do people tend to minimize? In this family, do people tend to discount? And as a little girl said to me many years ago, oh, in our family, we just pretend things are different than how they really are. And the word denial has such a negative connotation for many people, or we only think about it in terms of addiction, so you can ask about it in other ways. The common denominator for all of this is going to be the phenomena of loss. Let me give you a portrait of emotional isolation in the context of family. I have a little girl, well, I asked her to draw me a picture about what life was like for her at home. So she drew a picture of a house, and then you had two rooms that were disproportionately large, a bedroom and a living room. And she drew a picture of what would be her two parents in the living room, and they were arguing with each other. And the way you knew that is she had in cartoon fashion the little clouds like. She had their mouths wide open, and then these clouds with swear words and big exclamation marks coming from both of them. She drew her parents with their eyes bug-eyed, and then she drew them with their hair standing on end. And then you saw a set of footprints, two sets of footprints that ran from that living room into that very large bedroom. And in that very large bedroom, you saw two little girls hiding in what I think was fear, and I would probably say even that more extreme, maybe even possibly terror. As children do, they looked a lot like their parents. Their eyes were bug-eyed. She had drawn herself and her little sister with bug eyes and hair standing on end. But what was particularly significant is their mouths were shut. What was more significant was she and her sister at opposite ends of two different beds across the room from each other. At a time of great fear, at a time of terror, they did not have the ability to connect, bond, or be of support to each other. That's what I mean by emotional isolation. Now, the trauma that comes within the family can be very blatant. It can also be more subtle. What is most significant is that it is ongoing and chronic. Blatant forms of trauma, sometimes referred to as big T traumas, capital T traumas. Blatant forms of trauma would be physical abuse or sexual abuse within families. At the Young Adult Program, we call it CBC, Claudia Black Young Adult Center. At our Young Adult Center, we very recently have identified 5 forms of trauma that we think lie beneath so much of the addiction we see, the depression we see, and the anxiety we see. And so many of those forms will exist within this addicted family system. And physical abuse is certainly one of those that is highly prevalent for the people who end up coming into our system anyway. It used to be called discipline. The next day I'd get new clothes. It was just about 6 weeks ago I saw this on social media, and I've seen various forms of it, but it just prompted me to want to share this to you. Somebody said, a child that's being abused doesn't stop loving his or her parents. A child that's being abused stops loving him or herself. Again, a child that's being abused doesn't stop loving their parents, but they stop loving him or herself. Now, obviously, the ultimate act of abuse is when somebody's killed, but abuse, and we need to talk about it and describe it because people have tended to normalize it. Abuse involves the pushing, the shoving, the kicking, the pinching, the slamming somebody up against the wall until their teeth rattle. It can be terrorizing car rides. A more subtle form of abuse and one that's so pervasive that we've identified it as another scar is that of bullying. And there's a lot that can be said about bullying. I'm not going to talk about it extensively. We tend to think that bullying that takes place so often takes place amongst young people in the schoolyard, and it does. But if you're raised in a home where there's a substance use disorder, it often takes place within that family system before it even takes place in the school system. I had a young man who just came into treatment recently, and he's in for his heroin addiction. Was raised in a home by a single mother who was a heroin addict. Was raised with his 2 older brothers. Severe bullying on the part of his 2 brothers. Mom totally oblivious because she was so caught up in her addiction. In their bullying, they actually would put him in girls' clothing, and then they sent him outside and they'd lock the door so that he couldn't get in, so he'd be exposed for other people to see him. That they were responsible for feeding themselves. Many times they would only feed him in a doggy dish on the floor. Severe bullying. Mom, again, totally oblivious, and there was no father in the picture. And then what would ultimately happen for him is that they would invite their friends in, and there'd be more bullying, and then he'd end up with the other blatant trauma, and that is sexual abuse. A more subtle form of what I think physical abuse is, but I think equally as traumatizing, is the witness factor. In addictive family systems, oftentimes you may not be the direct recipient of the abuse that's going on, but you're certainly going to experience traumatic response to have been chronically the witness of. What I mean by the witness factor is, and for those of you who are not able to see this, the picture says violence comes with the alcohol. And there's a dad hollering out to his wife, I'll smack you anytime I want. And she's pulled a knife on him. She's going to defend herself. She's saying, oh, no, you won't. And we have a little boy in between saying, I'm scared. What I mean by the witness factor is the trauma that comes with the helplessness while witnessing something that is emotionally overwhelming. Now, the phenomena of the witness factor is something that people began to take a look at, or at least recognize, back in the mid-19th century. In our country, the railway system at that time was its primary mode of transportation, and there would be a lot of railway accidents, and there were a lot of people who would get killed, a lot of people who were injured. Well, they began to recognize while there would be a lot of people killed and injured, there was a subset of people who in fact didn't have any injury, and yet they showed the symptoms of having been injured. And they referred to them as having railway spine. And then they began to take a look at soldiers in World War I who had shell shock and realized that there were some similarities to those who'd had railway spine. And then they ultimately would come to realize in the Vietnam War, as they would come to identify post-traumatic stress disorder, that if you took two soldiers with equal combat exposure, and they ended up in the same incident, one was physically injured and one was not. The one that was not physically injured was actually more apt to show signs of post-traumatic stress than the one who was physically injured. So think about the ramifications for that with addiction in the family. I have a young man in early recovery, and as we're doing some emotional recovery work with him. We're talking about his growing up years, and he's saying, we used to have these rituals in my family. And it's always interesting because healthy rituals are such an important part of any kind of prevention work that we can do out in our community. But all of these kids have rituals. Some may be healthy, but many of them not so healthy. So he said, we had this ritual in our home. And he said, my dad would never come home until the bars were closed at night. And I shared a bedroom with my brother. We'd be asleep, but the minute my dad would pull up in his truck, we were wide awake. That hypervigilance. He said my dad would come into the house, make his way down to the bedroom, but he was so drunk he'd slam up against the walls. And he always came into our bedroom before he went to his. And he always beelined to my brother's bed. He said, I shared this bedroom with my brother. We were probably about 11 or 12 when this happened. And he said he'd come to my brother's bed and he'd pull him out of bed by the front of his shirt. And he'd start to smack him around. He'd hit him, smack him around. My brother would have a bloody nose, and he'd be bleeding. And then he'd start to cry. And then my dad would make more fun of him. And he said it always culminated. He'd take my brother by the front of that shirt. And then we had a mirror on the back of the door. And he slammed my brother right up. He said, as drunk as my dad was, somewhere he had the self-control. He would slam my brother right up to the front of that mirror within half of an inch. And then my brother was looking, all disheveled and just all upset. And he'd say, now, is that what a man looks like? And then he'd just drop him. The young man said to me, I waited. I waited for the day that my dad would come home, and he decided that I was going to be the one that he was going to make into that man. I have a young man who's just come out of treatment, for his substance use disorder, and just come out of treatment. He got into treatment as a consequence. He had the alternative of jail or a treatment process as a consequence of his criminal behavior. Now, I don't want to imply that his brother certainly wouldn't have problems, but I think this young man was very much impacted in terms of the chronicity and where he would witness his brother being abused in such a way on a nightly basis for a long period of time. Now, certainly, not all families where people are raised not with addictive disorders are going to have enough experience to generate post-traumatic stress. But if you witness family violence, particularly if it's repetitive, particularly if it's seen at an early age, it's very likely going to produce some types of trauma-related disorder. In addictive family systems, we not only see a lot of physical abuse, we not only see a lot of bullying, we see a lot of sexual abuse. We believe that 1 out of every 4 females today in our country is very likely to have been sexually abused at some point in her growing up years. That 1 out of every 6 to 8 males is very likely to have experienced sexual abuse in their growing up years. They are anywhere from 2 to 4 times more likely, though, to have experienced sexual abuse if they were raised in a substance-abusing family system. And I think that there are reasons for that. I think that they are primed for victimization. I think that to be raised with substance use disorder, that we are primed for victimization because, one, we may be starving for attention that other children are capable of getting in healthier functioning family systems, from not getting the attention that we need. And one of the things that we know about perpetrators from outside of our family system in particular is they often groom children under the guise of friendship. And this child's going to be more susceptible to that. I am less apt to speak up for the fear of not being believed because I'm already in a family system where the truth is not supported. I'm already in a family system where the truth is not supported, so I'm less apt to speak up to let somebody know what is going on for this process to be able to stop earlier. I'm already learning how to give other people the benefit of the doubt and not trusting my own perceptions. By the time children are 9 years of age, they lose the capacity, in addictive homes, they lose the capacity to identify the range of feelings that are part of the human experience. When I cannot tell you how it is I feel, when I cannot tell myself what it is I'm feeling, I can't use those feelings as cues and signals that propel me to let somebody know what it is that's going on. I'm already in a family system confused about appropriate boundaries, and very likely I'm already in a family system where I'm experiencing shame, the belief that who I am is not okay. So if I'm already internalizing this sense of shame, that who I am is not okay, and then something else happens that is more additionally shameful, shame put upon already existing shame is going to feel powerlessness and inaction and a sense of defeat. Again, it's going to get in the way of the ability for me to let somebody know what it is that's going on, and it's more likely the abuse to continue. I want to say that as I work with women who are addicts, women of any age who are addicts, it's almost a given that they've been sexually abused, oftentimes in the course of their active addiction, but very often it has preceded it as well. The point I was going to make is I work with women, there's often more than one perpetrator. Seldom do I work with a woman who has been sexually abused and by the time they get to some kind of treatment, there's only been one perpetrator. Now, I don't find that as common with guys. I certainly find sexual abuse common with guys, but I don't find the number of perpetrators being greater as common. But that's, again, just subjective, and I may ultimately come to find that to not be true. There may be, in fact, more. I do want to say in addictive family systems that the sexual abuse may be non-physical. I think it comes with the sexual name-calling that occurs. Kids that are called whores, sluts, hot pants, asking your son if he got laid last night, your 12-year-old, when he went out with his friends to a movie, and then laughing at that son, some kind of humiliating tone. A woman I was working with who was in her late 30s said, my dad, he'd call us all those names, and her dad happened to be an incest offender as well. And she said he'd call us all those names, whore, slut, etc. But it was never as bad as when he'd call us by my mother's name, Flo. He'd get this look in his eyes, and he'd call me by her name, and then he'd say, I wish I was young again, so I could have a shot at you. And she said, now that's when I felt so dirty. You see a lot of sexualized clothing, you see a lot of sexualized joking that takes place oftentimes in various parts of our culture, but even more so when there's addictive family systems. Another scar that we've identified, and certainly you see more of that when people come from addictive family systems, and that is the grief and loss that comes with having lost somebody in the family due to death. In that addictive family system, there's more likely to have been an overdose. There's more likely to have been somebody who's died as a direct result of their addiction, possibly due to a car accident. There's more likely to be suicide. And as I'm growing up in this family system, I don't have the skills to be able to attend to the grief, nor do I have the safety and support to be able to attend to that grief. So we end up working with a lot of people, not just young adults, but I think just a lot of people throughout their lifespan, wherever they may be, with complicated grief because they have the accumulation of losses through life, oftentimes by the time they get into a recovery process. And then, heaven help, one of the things we see with our young adults, they have using buddies who die, but sometimes those using buddy who dies are their siblings. Very recently, the 21-year-old who just lost her 16-year-old brother to an overdose, and she's the one who turned him on to the drugs. Or may have been using it at the very moment in which he overdosed. But so much of that which is traumatic is even so much more subtle than what it is I've talked about. So much more pervasive. Subtle is to live with fear on a chronic basis. At that time in your life when you're developing your sense of worth, your identity, your beliefs about the world, you're 5 years of age, you're 10 years of age. What I'm talking about is living with emotional abandonment. Now, emotional abandonment can be as a consequence of the verbal abuse. It can be as a consequence of the unpredictability, the lying, the criticizing, the emotional abuse, the not knowing what it is that's going to happen next. I feel scared when my mother drinks. A little girl who's scared and mom who's sort of in la la land with those pictures all above her. Family members, be it the children or the partners or the siblings, they live with fear. They live with fear of being with an impaired driver. They live with fear that the parents are going to break up. They live with fear that the parents aren't going to break up. They live with sadness for when that parent doesn't show up to something that's really important for me. They live with the sadness when the parent does show up to something that was really important for me. They live with what was said or what wasn't said, the sadness with that. Or the anger for the broken promises, or the anger for the fact that you didn't even try and quit. I mean, we're so unimportant to you, you don't even try. Or they live with the anger that you have gone to treatment 3 times and you were still using. And they live with the embarrassment, the outbursts that took place in front of friends, the way in which you looked, what it was you said. And they live with a lot of guilt. And most of the time, that's a false sense of guilt. They live with the guilt for not loving somebody they're supposed to. They live with the guilt thinking that they've caused, they are the reason for your depression, they are the reason for your suicide attempt, they are the reason for your drinking. I had a man in my office who was 43 years of age. He came in to see me on an outpatient basis for his depression and was raised in an alcoholic home. His father was alcoholic. And one of the things that we did, one of the things I realized about him in my work with him is how guilty he felt about so many things in his life. And my perception was so much of that guilt was false guilt. They were guilt for things he had no accountability or responsibility for. So one day we did a timeline regarding those areas for which he was guilty. And in this timeline, he would portray at the age of 12 a particular night, a very fateful night in his life. And he said, we had this ritual. He too had rituals in his family. He said, my father dictated that we would have dinner at 6 o'clock every night. Well, a lot of times in families will have dinner at a scheduled dinner time. So he said, my dad dictated, and that was his language, dictated that we would have dinner at 6 o'clock every night. So he said we did. My mom and I sat down to dinner at 6 o'clock every night. My dad was never there. He'd always come in. He'd come in at 7:38. He'd make his way slowly home, drinking his way home from work. And the ritual was he'd come into the house and he'd take the car keys and put them in his jacket and hang it on a hook. And he was already berating my mother as he walked through the door. He was telling her she couldn't do anything right. He was telling her what she'd done wrong that day. He hadn't been around to notice. And he said, and my mom was so scared, and she'd be up, and she always had food ready for him and in the oven and or in the refrigerator, and she was getting it back to the table. And he said, that was just the way it was. But something snapped in me that night. Something snapped. And he said, I got up from the table. I went over and I got those car keys out of that jacket. I came back and I threw them at him. He said, I can still remember those car keys bouncing off my desk chest. And he said, I screamed. I kept screaming, I just wish you'd go kill yourself. Well, that's all Dad needed was an excuse for an exit, an anger exit. He took those keys and he grabbed his coat and out that door he went. He was looking for an excuse to go spend the rest of the night with his buddies or his girlfriend or whoever that was going to be that he was going to use with. 20 minutes later, Dad killed himself in a car accident. I have a 43-year-old man in my office who does not understand that he's not responsible for the fact that his dad died that night. 43 years of age. A man in a major depression with a lot of suicidal ideation, not necessarily from that one incident, but from living a life of internalizing that I am responsible. And that one incident being highly pivotal. Now I want to say that young man was angry. And that young man in the moment might have even been hateful. That young man in the moment wished his dad would die. A lot of kids raised in these kinds of families have moments and they wish it would all be over. And maybe the only way they know for it to all be over is somebody's got to die in his house. That's more common than uncommon. And it is certainly not talked about to the degree and acknowledged to the degree that I think it needs to be talked about. He's not responsible for the fact that his dad died that night. His dad got behind the wheel of the car impaired. And that's what's responsible for the fact his dad died that night. let me summarize some of what I'm saying about this, and sort of give you an idea, just using this little picture here. I have a little girl who gets up. She gets up some morning. She gets up, she lives with her mom, single mom. She's really hungry. She's only 5 or 6 years of age. And so she goes into her mother's bedroom and she wants to wake her mom up or get her mom up because she needs her mom to make her something for breakfast. Well, mom is really hungover. And when the little girl shakes her mom and says, Mom, I'm hungry, can you get up so you can fix me something? Mom, lashes out at her physically. What do you want? Get away from me. Who do you think I am? You make yourself something. I don't have it. And she said, I'm sick. Can't you see that I'm sick? Just get out of here. And the little girl, backs up and she gets, feels, that, it's not safe in here. She leaves the room and then she chastises herself. I shouldn't have woken my mom up. Maybe I'm not really that hungry. But, she doesn't make herself breakfast. Somehow this family system is such that mom has always been the one to make her something for breakfast. She doesn't make herself anything for breakfast. So she sits there and she's hungry. She lets a little bit of time pass and finally she decides, well, maybe, I'll try it again. So she makes her way into what is called figure 2 here. She makes her way into her mother. And this time, mom has had a little bit to smoke and a little bit to drink because her daughter had woken her up. So she's alleviated her withdrawal symptoms. So when the little girl says, do you think you could get me something? She doesn't get physically close to her this time. Do you think you can get me something to eat? Mom, I'm really, really hungry. Mom says, well, yeah, sure, I can get you something to eat. You want a peanut butter sandwich? You want a bologna sandwich? Yeah, I'll get you. So what do you want? And so the little girl tells her, and she says, just come back in a little bit. I'll meet you in the kitchen a little bit. So figure 3, little girl doesn't have to wait near so long because she hears her mother out in the kitchen. She approaches her mom in the kitchen. Now her mom is on what we call the rising side of the blood alcohol curve. Not only has mom made her a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, she pulls her up into her lap and then she smothers her with kisses. She tells her how much she loves her. The little girl is just taking it all in. She loves, her mother really loves her. The slobbery kisses are one thing, but that's okay. She'll take them over not. Well, mom is so impacted at this moment that not only has she made her little girl a sandwich, she says, you've been wanting a bicycle for a long period of time. We're going to go out and we're going to get you a bicycle today. So, just let me get dressed and we're going to go out. So the little girl leaves for a period of time. After a while, she comes back to see her mom. Now, mom's on the falling side of the blood alcohol curve. Mom is not near so responsive. She says, what are you talking about? I didn't tell you that we're going to get a bicycle. Who do you think? You think that money just grows on a tree around here? Where's your no good father? He doesn't give me any money for you. And she just, just slams this little girl. Little girl backs up thinking, what did I do wrong? I shouldn't have gone out and played. I shouldn't have left her. I should have stayed right here. Somehow she internalizes that I didn't handle this okay. And it's my fault that mom is so angry with me. And besides that, I'm not even going to get a bicycle now. And then what you're going to see in the last figure, mom's passed out. The younger the child is, it's very easy for them when they're really young to think a parent has died in that moment. Kids who go put their hands on their parent's stomach to see if he's dead or alive. Hand goes down, hand comes up. What kids learn to do in time is often they'll ask for what they want when a parent's on the rising side. They don't know they're on the rising side, but they become very hypervigilant to the signs. They learn to ask for what they want when the parent's on the rising side, and then they learn to take what they need when the parent's on the falling side. So I might ask for some money when I think you're on the rising side because you're more apt to give it to me. But when you're on the falling side, I'm just going to go into your wallet and take it for myself. I want to remind you of the epigram for the National Children's Defense Fund in the United States. It says, Dear Lord, be good to me, the sea is so wide and my boat is so very, very small. That child's neurology, that child's personality, in essence, that little boat that they need to navigate in is still developing. Childhood injuries, even when they are more mild compared to somebody else, because they are chronic, they have lasting effects because they're occurring at the same time that the body and the personality and the brain are being formed. Now, I want to go back to what I just said about childhood injuries, even when they're more mild compared to somebody else. There's always somebody with the worst horror story. There always is. And one of my messages over the many years is to not negate your experience, because maybe it's not as blatant as somebody else's. Maybe it's not as horrific as somebody else's. but your losses are still your losses. And you have as much right to heal from your own pain as they will to heal from theirs. Abandonment comes in a variety of sources. When I think of abandonment, it's when I have to hide a part of who I am in order to be acceptable. Or maybe it's what I have to do in order to protect myself. When I have to hide my mistakes, my vulnerabilities. It's not okay to make a mistake in this family. Or I learn that there's something wrong with me. When I have to hide my feelings, when it's not okay for me to have needs, that's a form of abandonment. And in some families, it's not okay for me to have accomplishments. This is if I'm betraying. If you are the first person in your family to experience recovery, oftentimes they will make fun of you. They will act as if you're betraying them as a system. Who do you think you are now that you're not drinking, huh? You're going to come home and tell us, we're not supposed to be doing this? You hear a lot of that. Who do you think you are to go on and get a college education, or not just because you finished high school and I didn't? When somebody's disappointed with you and they speak to your worth and value versus what you did or didn't do. When somebody wants you to be an extension of themselves, not allowing you to have your own dreams. When somebody says that you're responsible for their behaviors, they're not taking responsibility for themselves. When parents' esteem is predominantly derived through a child's behavior. Now, for all of you who are parents, not everybody here is, but for those of you who are, obviously how you feel about yourself on a given day may be impacted by your child's certain behavior. But if your esteem is solely derived, that's what I'm implying here, then that's when we ultimately, somebody's going to be experiencing abandonment there. When children are treated as peers with no parent-child distinction. When there are chronically unrealistic expectations. That's not on the slide, but it should be on the slide as well. For a moment, I want to talk to you about two other factors that I see that also speak to emotional abandonment. And there's something that we have learned as I have worked with people, young people in particular, who come from more affluent families, called children of affluence. And that is two particular factors are emerging with kids who come from higher socioeconomic impacted families. And that is the issue of perfectionism and isolation. Now, so oftentimes when I've talked about people being isolated, I've talked about them being emotionally isolated. But in these families, they're not only emotionally isolated, they're also socially isolated from the other adults in their life, from the significant adults in their life. Now, these are also kids who experience a lot of achievement pressure from their parents. There are parents who are typically over-involved in how well their children are performing and under-involved in other areas of their life. Over-involved in how well their children are performing, under-involved in other areas of their life. When parents place an excessively high value on outstanding performance, children come to see anything less than that, anything less than perfection, as absolute failure. Now, I think perfectionism stems because really important people in my life have unrealistic expectations of me, and I internalize that for myself. And I push to excel, to be the best. I have fear and shame nipping at the seat of my pants the entire time. But no matter what I do, it is never good enough. And ultimately, I come to internalize that as who I am is not good enough. And this is really important because we're watching people come into treatment with a diagnosis of depression, actively suicidal, sometimes having attempted to take their life, and perfectionism is their primary issue here. Again, perfectionism comes because people have unrealistic expectations, and I learned that I had to do things right in order to be acceptable, in order to know that I have value here. Let me say that controlling and over-involved parents have kids feeling angry and has them feeling alienated. And as one young man said, my mother is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Everywhere is about intrusion and nowhere is about lack of connection. Everywhere is about intrusion, nowhere is about lack of connection. Intrusion is about the needs of parents. Support is about the needs of a child. When it comes to what we also see, and I don't think this is necessarily having to do with socioeconomic factors, but as we work with people of greater socioeconomic privilege, it's almost a given. We see a lot of father hunger. Dad's not involved in a manner where the younger person feels supported or validated. And when that happens, you usually see the counterpart parent experiencing a lot of enmeshment with with the kids. When I'm enmeshed with my kids, I fuse in relationships. I do not provide the structure. I do not provide the discipline. I can't set the limits that I need to set because I do not want them to abandon me. Now we have parents who do not want their kids to abandon them, is how they literally fused in that relationship. Absentee parenting is a form of abandonment. And parents are absent for a host of reasons. Sometimes they're absent because of their own depression. Sometimes they're absent because of their own addictions. Sometimes they're absent because of their careers. Sometimes they're absent because of their busyness out in the community. Absenteeism, parents are preoccupied with something other than parenting. All of these, what I call scars, create a synergistic effect, a multiplying effect, meaning 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, and now equals 3, 4, 5. And ultimately, when you live with this, you're going to internalize the sense of shame. I see shame as the belief that there's something inherently wrong with who I am. Some people talk about shame as a feeling. Personally, I think there's a lot of feelings one experiences as they're taking on that belief system. As I take on the belief that who I am is not okay, I've probably experienced fear, embarrassment, humiliation, loneliness, anger, and think of it as a wide mouth funnel. I have all those feelings. The more I have those feelings, the more it becomes just a narrow tunnel. And in that narrow tunnel, I no longer have the ability to feel. I only know my shame, that who I am is not okay. People don't think of themselves as being in shame. They think of themselves as not okay, less than, stupid, inferior, insufficient, damaged, dirty, damaged goods. Again, the words will vary. The words vary, and I also think things like damaged and damaged goods is probably something that I hear more when somebody's had more blatant abuses, more big T abuses in their life. So, but my point being, we have a lot of feelings. The more you come to know your shame, the more disconnected you are from your emotional self. And in that recovery process, you come down that narrow tunnel, and that wide mouth funnel begins to open up. And people ultimately will get back in touch with those feelings as a part of that process. I always say there's 2 big resistances to recovery. I'd really like recovery, but I'd like it to be pain-free. Thank you. And I prefer to do it all by myself. And I've always believed that when you allow other people to be a part of the process, they will shine the light and provide the hope when that's so difficult for you to do that for yourself. And as has been said, and I've heard it here at this conference, what we're dealing with are diseases of disconnection. And what recovery about is connection with self and connection with others. And we deserve to allow other people to be a part of this process. In essence, this is where we go with our shame. Shame is really the foundation underneath that, all of that trauma that we're talking about here. This family legacy, it will continue. You see the legacy continue to act itself out emotionally. You see it act itself out spiritually. People are running, very oftentimes seeking medicators, not realizing they're on this well-trodden path, and they will do that which comes most naturally. Alan said I was 11 when I had my first drink, and I hated the taste, but I felt the glow. I had a hole in my gut that was so deep, and alcohol and drugs were the only thing that would fill it up. I drank and I used to get absolutely blithering numb. And Hayden would say, I was like a rat running on a treadmill, keen on receiving that coveted reward. I chased my highs on a daily basis. I'd do anything to escape. I don't even know what I was running from, but I was running fast. Today, the legacy may not be the same drug of choice which somebody was raised with, but it's typically some part of the continuum of addictive disorders. And more often than not, when you're working with addiction today, you're working with more than one addiction. Seldom do we treat somebody with an eating disorder today who doesn't have an addiction to a substance. Seldom do you treat a sex addict who doesn't have an addiction to a substance. Certainly, oftentimes, your alcoholic could also be a gambler as well. And your porn-addicted young man or young woman could also be an anorexic, and they could also have a gaming addiction. So again, my point is, oftentimes we have a multiplicity of addictions in response. And on top of all that, you have your trauma responses beyond addictive disorders. You have your self-harm, your suicidality, you have your emotional dysregulation, and that depression and anxiety. We see this legacy continue through trauma repetition in terms of committed relationships with somebody who's very similar to what it is you saw growing up. Cindy's 23. She said, I remember I really only wanted one thing in my growing up years, and that was to do it differently than how it was being done around me. So I'm 23. My husband's in jail for a felony drinking and driving charge. And I look into the eyes of my baby. He's 12 months old, whom I've just thrown across the living room floor. My world and sanity crumbled. I was doing it exactly as they had done it. And Cindy was very fortunate. That's what propelled her to reach out and to get help. And it was help that would truly change that immediate family system for her. Sharon was raised in a home where her father was alcoholic, who was also an incest perpetrator. And she said, I've been married and divorced 5 times. And she was 47 years old. Claudia, I've been married and divorced 5 times. And I just realized I never divorced the right man to begin with. And that was my father. So let me begin to review with you so much of what I have said. I'm going to do this by, this sort of is a good summary of what I've said. So Kim grows up with a severely alcoholic father and a very hypercritical mother. From the time that she's in kindergarten, her mother's very preoccupied with her body, her weight. She's putting her on a scale. Soon after Kim turns 9, Dad will go into rehab for his alcoholism and he will stop drinking. A month after that, Mom reveals that she's had a long-time boyfriend, actually for the past 3 years, and she takes off to go live with her boyfriend, leaving the kids at home with Dad, who's just newly sober. Now, for the next 8 months, her parents are going to fight over custody, and there's a very angry, what we call a very acrimonious divorce. Now at 14, we have a young girl who's exercising excessively to keep herself thin. She's binging on junk food, causing herself to throw up. She also begins to party a lot. She's drinking excessively, and she's taking a large amount of opiates. One night, when drunk, she passes out. She's raped by several guys at a party. One of them posts a video of the rape on social media. Kim's humiliation, her shame, and inability to reach out to her parents continues, as does the partying. There's binging, bulimia, drinking, drug use, sexual assaults. All of that will continue. By the age of 24, she's using heroin and alcohol addictively. By the age of 31, she's attempted suicide 3 times. So again, what you see is the accumulation of trauma, you see an addictive disorder, more trauma, the addiction ultimately is there. I want to show you one more of these. In late 1998, Julie, she falls while she's riding a horse. She seriously injures herself, her pelvis. She's prescribed prescription pain pills during that recovery process. In the process now, we have an addiction, becomes addicted to those pills. Then, her husband, who's a firefighter, at 9/11, the body's never found. The building collapses, his body's never found. Suddenly, she's widowed. She has traumatized boys, 7 and 9. She begins to drink herself to sleep. As time passes, Julie's drinking and pill usages keeps her in bed longer and longer. She becomes moody, unpredictable. Boys are becoming more self-sufficient. Enables her, by them being more self-sufficient, enables her to take more pills and alcohol. By the time her oldest is 15, Julie's depressed, she's manic, she's overreactive, she's disengaged. She provides little structure or support for the boys. The oldest throws himself into school. The youngest throws himself into the internet, video games. He becomes more isolated. Eventually, through an intervention, this woman, this mother, gets into recovery. But when she wakes up, she has one son who's quite responsible, and she has a younger son showing the signs of gaming and porn addiction as well. Well, I wanted you to know I really didn't forget something that I said earlier. Remember what I said? Remember Therese when I started Genogram? Well, one of the things I said about Therese was she didn't get treated appropriately. So somebody's going to see her again. She shows up. I think she's really lucky because when she shows up again somewhere in the behavioral health care system, she shows up in an addiction treatment program. And that's what I mean by she's very lucky. She didn't end up in a community mental health center where somebody didn't know what to do with her. She didn't end up in a primary health care physician's office where somebody didn't know. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't resources out there that would have, but that history didn't show itself. She ended up back in, not for the first time, exposed to an addiction treatment program. So what's different about this? Only those of you in front will probably notice, the others of you can't see. What's different in this genogram?
Kids are older.
Kids are older. And I just love that. You know how the kids get older, but we don't? Actually, I just said the age of the kids down here. But yeah, the kids are older. Time has passed. Her son has come into a treatment program. Her daughter left home when the daughter was 15. The truth was with Therese, her life became more functional. Her life became more functional because probably the medication she was taking, and yet she didn't experience recovery. And in that process, she would have some great difficulty parenting, and as I said, the 15-year-old literally moved out and moved in with some friends, the daughter, when she was 15. Now what's happened is the son, she and her son are living in a condo in Florida, and the son is living upstairs and she's downstairs. Her son has been using drugs and selling drugs in an upstairs bedroom. She has not walked up those stairs in 3 years. Not walked up those stairs since he's been 15 years of age to even begin to take a look at what it is that's happening there. He comes into treatment. He's not too motivated for treatment. He's in treatment as well because of some problems, and the court system has allowed him a treatment process. But the opportunity is there for her. I want to go back to, and him, I want to go back to a slide that I had up earlier. These are her family of origin issues that impacted her being involved with partners who were addicted. These same family of origin issues are what will enable the son and keep them stuck in a family system without that recovery process. So I'm not going to walk back through those as much as to make that point. Every one of those same behaviors is going to affect her individually, is going to affect her in a relationship with partners, and certainly going to affect her in her ability to parent in a healthy way with her kids. Complex is probably a pivotal word when we talk about families affected by addiction. It's a complex family system, but I love working in the field of addictive disorders, and I've been doing it for a very long time. I continue to feel passionate about it, and that is because, as I say, it's been an honor to be able to be witness to what I think of as the miracles of recovery. And they don't just spontaneously happen. They happen because people take action, and we can be a part of many people's journey. And as I say, it's really an honor in which to be able to witness that. But I wanted to leave you with a sense of that possibility for recovery comes with as we can help people identify what their primary disorders are, and oftentimes, as I said, a multiplicity. The potential for co-occurring disorders and the multiple addictions. A willingness to prioritize intergenerational family dynamics. We need to ask clients about their original family history. We need to ask pointed questions about the use of alcohol and other drugs in those families, the possibility of other kinds of addictive behaviors because they're often process addictions, the possibility of physical and sexual abuses. We need to recognize the impact of chronic loss and stress as a trauma factor. And we need to work with what we refer to as a bottoms-up, top-down approach. And what I mean by that is we need to integrate modalities, treatment modalities, that help to regulate that nervous system, calm that limbic system, so that wonderful cognitive behavior work that we've been doing for 40 years has the potential to make a difference. You know, the truth is most of us, at least in the U.S., have had a lot of training with cognitive behavior work historically. And I think there's a really important role for that in our treatment with family members and the addicts. But what I'm finding is they don't have the ability to respond to that when they're so severely dysregulated. And today we can integrate, without great cost, by the way, we can integrate various forms and various modalities that help people to become more emotionally regulated and, as I say, calm down that limbic system that's on fire. And when I say not necessarily expensive, I mean we integrate expressive arts, we integrate mindfulness practices. And those mindfulness practices might have to do with meditation, but they could have to do with mindfulness walking, with breathing techniques. The research is out there in terms of all the possibilities, and they don't have to be costly to us. Realistic and important goals. Lessen the emotional reactivity by calming the part of the brain that is keeping that person in fight, flight, and freeze. Helping them learn how to tolerate their uncomfortable feelings without engaging in self-defeating behavior. How to be able to stay in the present. How to define boundaries that will give me a sense of safety, internal and external boundaries. How to set appropriate limits that honor those boundaries. How to disrupt shame-based messages, shame-based thinking, and to recognize when I'm in shame-based behavior. How to challenge my cognitive distortions, and ultimately to learn skills. We do a lot of this now, and you need to give yourself credit as you work with people individually, in group, in outpatient, in residential, in inpatient. But again, I think if I could just give you one picture, if we just followed this by itself, it would give people the foundation of recovery as they go out into their communities. What I think that we're really doing, in doing this, we're helping them to create a new narrative, and their task is to live in that new narrative. I leave you with a couple thoughts. One is to please don't ever underestimate the role you play in somebody's life when in the context of safety you offer them validation and truth. Don't ever estimate the role you play. You know, we're in the work that we do, we're in the profession that we do because we have faith. And that leads me to my last point. You're as important as those you work with, and take as good care of yourself as you do your clients. Thank you for being with me tonight.